Mark, Lisa, Tom, and Sarah were lifelong friends looking for a break from the monotony of their urban lives. They decided to embark on a camping trip in a remote forest known for its dense trees and untouched beauty. Locals called it Whispering Woods because of eerie tales about sounds that seemed to follow visitors. But the group laughed off the warnings as mere folklore. The first day was uneventful, filled with hiking and setting up camp. By evening, they had a roaring fire going, and the forest came alive with the glow of flames and their cheerful banter. As night fell, the usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets and rustling leaves, faded into silence. Lisa pointed out how unsettling the stillness was, but Mark brushed it off. "It's just nature's way of telling us to sleep," he joked. Around midnight, while everyone lay in their tents, whispers began. Faint and unintelligible, they seemed to come from all directions. Tom zipped open his tent and poked his head out. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Lisa joined him, rubbing her eyes. "It's just the wind," she insisted. But Sarah noticed something odd. The fire, which should have been dying out, still flickered, casting tall shadows against the trees. As they stared, one of the shadows moved, distinct and deliberate, out of sync with the others. Tom grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the trees, but the beam revealed nothing. They all retreated to their tents, trying to ignore the mounting unease. The next morning, the group woke to find Mark gone. His tent was unzipped, his backpack untouched, and his boots missing. At first, they thought he had gone for an early hike, but hours passed, and he didn't return. "Let's split up and search," Tom suggested, though Sarah was hesitant. "We should stick together," she said. But fear for Mark's safety outweighed her caution. While combing through the woods, Sarah found a trail of footprints, Mark's, judging by their size, leading deeper into the forest. They called his name repeatedly, their voices echoing in the still air. Finally, the trail ended at a massive ancient oak tree. At the base of the tree lay an old, weathered leather journal. Sarah picked it up, curious, and began flipping through the pages. Her face turned pale as she read. "Sarah? What is it?" Lisa asked. It's us," Sarah stammered. The journal detailed everything they had done since arriving at the campsite, down to the jokes they had made around the fire. It even mentioned Mark's disappearance and their current search. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Tom asked, grabbing the journal. But as he skimmed through, his hands began to shake. The last entry was dated exactly 100 years ago, and the handwriting was identical to Sarah's. Before they could process what was happening, the forest around them grew darker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Sarah dropped the journal, and they ran toward the campsite. When they reached the clearing, they found their tents collapsed, their supplies scattered, and no sign of the fire they had lit the night before. In its place stood the ancient oak tree, its branches stretching ominously toward the sky. A final gust of wind blew through the clearing, carrying the whispers with it. The last thing Sarah saw before everything went black was her own face etched into the bark of the tree, frozen in a scream. The story ends with the journal lying on the forest floor, its pages blank once more, waiting for the next visitors to Whispering Woods. The Johnson family, Mom, Dad, and their teenage twins, Mike and Ellie, had been looking forward to their camping trip for months. Life in the city had become overwhelming, and this was their chance to reconnect with nature. They picked a well-known campsite deep in the woods, a place far enough from civilization to feel adventurous but not too remote to be unsafe. By the time they arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. They quickly set up their tent, gathered wood, and lit a crackling campfire. The flames danced in the cool evening air, and they huddled close, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. Mike, always the joker, started the first story. So there was this guy who heard a voice calling his name in the woods. He followed it and, poof, He disappeared forever. Ellie rolled her eyes. Lame. Let me tell you a real story. As she launched into her tale about a haunted camper who cursed everyone who entered the forest, something strange happened. A faint, distorted voice echoed her words from the darkness. The camper cursed everyone who entered the forest. The voice repeated, each syllable stretched and warped, as if spoken through a broken speaker. Did you hear that? Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Dad shined his flashlight into the trees, but nothing was there. It's probably the wind, he said, though his tone betrayed his own unease. The family decided to call it a night, retreating to their tent, but the whispers didn't stop. Every now and then, they heard their own words from earlier repeated in that same eerie, broken voice. The camper cursed everyone. Did you hear that? None of them slept well, and by morning, the atmosphere around the camp felt heavy and oppressive. They decided to cut the trip short and pack up. As they loaded the car, the voice spoke again, this time, closer. Did you hear that? It mocked. Mom froze. That wasn't an echo. That was right behind us. They piled into the car, panic setting in. Dad started the engine, but as they pulled onto the dirt path leading out of the woods, the voice spoke again. This time, it came from inside the car. Did you hear that? The family turned toward the back seat, and Ellie screamed. Reflected in the rearview mirror was a shadowy figure sitting between her and Mike. Its face was featureless, but its mouth was stretched unnaturally wide, mimicking Ellie's scream. The screen cuts to black as the family's screams echo in the silence of the forest. The final shot is of the extinguished campfire, the faint sound of distorted laughter floating through the air. Jake and Emily, two adventurous college students, loved the thrill of exploring places untouched by modern life. One fall weekend, they set out to hike deep into the wilderness, far from the designated trails. They wanted a real adventure, away from crowded campsites and tourist traps. After hours of hiking, they stumbled upon a secluded clearing with an old abandoned campsite. There were rusted lanterns hanging from tree branches, a fire pit filled with ashes and scattered belongings, a torn backpack, a faded map, and some unrecognizable tools. This is perfect, Jake said, dropping his pack. Feels like we're stepping into history. Emily frowned. It's weird, though. It looks like whoever was here just vanished. She pointed to a mug still half filled with water, as if the previous campers had left in a hurry. Ignoring her unease, Jake set up their tent near the remnants of the old campsite. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a deep orange, and the clearing grew eerily silent. As they prepared for the night, Emily found a diary among the scattered items. The leather cover was cracked, and its pages were yellowed. She opened it and read an entry aloud. September 15th, 1949. We've been hearing strange noises at night, whispers that seem to come from nowhere. Mary says we should leave, but I want to stay. I need to understand what's happening here. Emily shivered. Jake, this place is creepy. Let's pack up and go. Jake laughed. Come on, it's just an old journal. Don't let your imagination run wild. That night, as they lay in their tent, strange noises began. First, it was the sound of leaves rustling, though there was no wind. Then came the faint crunch of footsteps circling their tent. Emily grabbed Jake's arm. Do you hear that? She whispered. Jake unzipped the tent and shined his flashlight outside. The beam revealed nothing but the abandoned campsite, shrouded in shadows. Probably just an animal, he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. The noises stopped, and they eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, they woke to find their tent surrounded by fresh footprints. They weren't alone. We need to leave, now, Emily insisted. As they packed their gear, Emily noticed something alarming. Their belongings looked different. Her once brand new boots were scuffed and cracked, as if they had been worn for decades. Jake's compass, shiny and modern, was now rusted and useless. "What's happening?" Emily gasped. Jake opened his pack to find their food spoiled and their water bottles empty, though they had been full the night before. Desperation mounting, they decided to follow their tracks back to the trail. But the forest had changed. The trees were denser, and the path they had taken to the campsite was gone. Every direction looked the same, as if the forest were rearranging itself to keep them trapped. Hours passed, and the sun began to set again. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled back into the same clearing they had left that morning. But this time, the abandoned campsite was gone. In its place was a single weathered photograph nailed to a tree. It showed Jake and Emily standing in the clearing, their expressions frozen in fear. The final shot lingers on the photo as whispers fill the air, and the screen fades to black. Chris was an experienced camper who often ventured alone into remote wilderness areas. He loved the solitude of nature and the challenge of surviving without modern conveniences. This time, he chose a forest not marked on any official map. Locals warned him to stay away, claiming strange disappearances and odd occurrences in the area. Dismissing the stories as superstition, Chris was determined to explore it. He reached the forest in the late afternoon. The trees were ancient and massive, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a dense canopy. Despite the eerie atmosphere, Chris found a suitable clearing and set up camp. As he gathered firewood, he noticed something strange about the trees. Many of them had natural patterns in their bark that resembled faces. Chris chuckled. "Nature's Rorschach test," he muttered, brushing off the oddity. That night, as he sat by the fire, he had the unsettling feeling of being watched. It wasn't the usual paranoia that sometimes accompanied solo trips. It felt specific, focused, and unrelenting. He scanned the woods with his flashlight, but all he saw were the trees, their bark patterns now seeming more defined, more human-like. Shaking off the thought, he crawled into his tent and fell into a restless sleep. At some point during the night, a snapping branch jolted him awake. He lay still, listening. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, came from just outside his tent. "Hello? Who's there?" he called, grabbing his flashlight. No answer. When he unzipped the tent and shined the light around, the forest seemed to close in on him. The trees were unnervingly close, their bark faces staring down at him, their hollow eyes glinting in the moonlight. Chris decided he wasn't staying another night. He packed up immediately and began hiking back toward his car. The forest seemed different, though. The trails twisted and split in ways he didn't remember, and landmarks he had noted earlier were nowhere to be seen. As dawn approached, he found himself back in the clearing where he had camped. Exhausted, he sat down to catch his breath. That's when he noticed something chilling. The trees surrounding the clearing now bore faces that unmistakably resembled people. Their expressions were frozen in fear, horror, and despair. One face stood out among the rest. It was his. Chris stumbled back, heart pounding. He turned to run, but the forest had closed in, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. Whispers began to rise, low at first, then louder, echoing his own panicked words. "Hello? Who's there?" Desperate, he clawed at the dirt and tried to escape, but his vision began to blur. The last thing he saw was the forest itself shifting and pulsating, as if alive, as the ground beneath him turned to shadow. When hikers eventually stumbled upon the clearing months later, they found no trace of Chris. What they did find was a single tree with a fresh face etched into its bark, its expression forever frozen in a silent scream. The camera lingers on the tree as the whispers return, growing louder, before the screen fades to black. Alex and his friends, Ben and Sarah, had been planning a weekend camping trip for weeks. They had heard about a remote camping site tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest and mist, a place where few dared to go. Intrigued by the idea of isolation, They packed their gear and set off for the secluded spot. As they hiked deeper into the forest, the path grew thinner, and the trees seemed to grow closer together, creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler, and a thick mist rolled in, enveloping them. It was as if the forest itself was closing in, and the further they went, the harder it became to see. They arrived at the campsite just as the last traces of daylight faded. The area was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of running water from a nearby stream. They set up their tent near the edge of a small clearing, and as they did, the mist grew heavier, shrouding everything in a thick white veil. As night fell, they sat around the campfire, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he glanced toward the misty edges of the clearing, he swore he saw movement, fleeting shadows that disappeared as soon as he looked directly at them. He brushed it off as paranoia, but the unease lingered. Around midnight, Sarah got up to use the bathroom, walking toward the trees near the edge of the clearing. A few moments later, she screamed. Alex and Ben rushed over, only to find her standing frozen, staring at something in the mist. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. She pointed toward the trees. "There's something watching me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex strained his eyes, but the mist was too thick to see anything. "It's probably just the fog, Sarah. Let's go back to the campfire." But as they walked back, Alex couldn't help but feel that the mist had grown thicker, as if something was closing in around them. They huddled around the fire, trying to calm down, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. The air grew cold, and the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. Then, Ben's voice broke the silence. "Look," he whispered urgently. Alex and Sarah turned to see what Ben was pointing at. At the edge of the clearing, faint glowing eyes appeared in the mist, dozens of them, watching, unblinking. They were scattered throughout the trees, their pale light piercing through the fog. The eyes didn't blink or move, but they were everywhere, all around them. Sarah began to panic. "We need to leave, now." But the mist had thickened, and the path back seemed to disappear into the haze. The eyes grew larger, closer, until they were right up against the camp. Alex could hear a faint whispering, voices carried on the wind, but no words he could understand. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the eyes blinked, all at once. The mist swirled violently, and a cold wind swept through the clearing. The fire flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. When the mist cleared, Alex found himself alone. Ben and Sarah were gone, vanished without a trace. The forest was silent again, and the only evidence of the night's events was a faint, unnatural glow in the distance, the eyes still watching. Which one of these eerie tales gave you the chills the most? Was it the mysterious shadow in the woods, or the haunting eyes in the mist that creeped you out? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed these creepy camping stories, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let me know which story you want to hear next, and share your thoughts with me in the comments below.